Hi there, welcome back. If you're listening while driving, crafting, or just resting for a moment, I'm glad you're here. If you're joining me through YouTube, this is a long-form spoken podcast meant to be listened to slowly, more like a conversation at the hearth than a fast-paced video. So feel free to do chores, walk on a treadmill, garden, or drive while you listen. Today we're going to spend some time chatting about the Outdwellers, beings considered outside or at cross purposes for many practitioners. But are they really? And how does one interact with these beings for ritual, but then come back to the group fold afterwards? I have a theory to share and a possible solution for the issue to be discussed during this podcast. So whether you're a solitary group practitioner, brand new to the path, or simply finding your way back again, you're welcome here. We have a lot to discuss, so let's get going. Many years ago, I belonged to a Druid organization called Anriac Féin, or ADF. During my time there, one of the pieces of ritual that always stayed with me was the acknowledgement of the Outdwellers. It was a soft part of the core order, meaning that while groves added it to the liturgy, it wasn't a requirement. It was a quick section to acknowledge powers that didn't belong in the ritual, or might cause harm to the participants. So words were spoken and a token offering was made before moving on. We gave it space, we named it, we recognized that not everything belonged inside what we were building. At the time, I took that at face value. It meant there were forces outside the ritual space that needed to be acknowledged so they wouldn't interfere. Simple, respectful, contained. I didn't push it further than that until much later. Over the years, that piece kept coming back to me, even after I left ADF. During a community festival event, there had been some violence at the site the night before. We were asked by organizers to offer a blessing for the remainder of the event to help other vendors find some peace the next morning. We gathered around in a large circle, welcoming anyone who wished to participate regardless of belief. We drew quite a crowd on that misty morning. I was handling the Outdwellers portion while the others led the main liturgy. Something told me to stand outside the circle of participants and quietly walk the space as a guardian would. After calling to those who guard the ways, I shifted my focus beyond just those physically present into that liminal understanding. I was pretty good at that then. I walked that circle, the sounds of the prayers going in and out of focus for me, for nearly 20 minutes. Afterwards, the other druids closed down the rite to begin the last day of the festival. What was interesting was how many people approached me to say that having me walk that space helped them to relax, knowing they were safe under that layer of protection. I'm not so sure it was me specifically, but rather those entities who walked with me to guard the site. The remainder of the festival went off without a hitch, and the energy of those present was much uplifted. I felt a little off the rest of the day, like something was forgotten. It eventually faded, but I was to be reminded of it later at a different rite. I think the epiphany truly came during a Vedic midsummer rite where I was calling the gatekeeper Indra. As a Norse practitioner, I wasn't super familiar with Vedic devas and rituals, so once I was assigned the role I would be serving, I knew I needed to research. What I discovered while reviewing this deva and the proper way to invoke and honor him was a feeling that the Outdwellers and the space they hold in a rite is very different to what I had experienced previously. I was not a newbie to ritual practice, nor the role of gatekeeper for the Outdwellers. But this hit me differently. The more I worked on it, the more was revealed to me. When you serve as the person, recognizing the Outdwellers, and entering into treaty with them, you become part of that role. What I mean is, you don't just say pretty words, make an offering, and then go stand by the fire. you become part of the sacrifice. You share that space with the gatekeepers as the boundary line between the ritual participants and those beings considered to be the outdwellers for that rite. You are in liminal space with the guardians, and you stay in that space, holding the line until after the official ritual ends. No going to the fire to make offerings, no speaking other roles or prayers. You can't. You are now other until the rite is over. By the contract made, you are now an outdweller as much as those other spirits. It is both humbling and powerful to fill that role. During that rite, I held the folk up on the path to make my prayers. The people handling the aspersing, blessing with smoke and water to purify, were standing after me. The participants had no choice but to wait for me to finish, and then walk past me while I held the way. I offered first a prayer via the Rig Veda to Indra. I then called out the invocation I had written for him to come and stand with me to ward the gates for those gathered. Then I recognized the outdwellers and entered into treaty with them on behalf of the people. It was a long piece, I grant you, but oh my gods, was it worth it? The ground shook slightly, and the leaves on all the trees waved during the words I offered. Then everything went still. You could feel the pulsing energy of the metaphorical door the folk walked through after passing me. When the last person was purified and making their way to the fire below, I stayed behind with Indra beside me, keeping the ways guarded and closed to all that might wreak havoc. I couldn't hear the words of the rite, even though they were only about 20 feet or so from me. It felt like I was in a completely different world. I knew that they were going through the core order of ritual. I knew who was doing which parts. Yet due to my role and how I was performing it, I could not hear them or participate. Before the rite began, I had given my offerings to the Druid in charge to make on my behalf. In reviewing how I would be conducting my part, I had already made it clear I would not be actively participating beyond the guardian role for this rite. So arrangements were made ahead of time. And it was the correct thing to do. I was separate from the folk. I was other. Once the last prayers were offered and the folk were just communing with each other, I completed my role quietly and said farewell to Indra. I then walked down to the site to the small core group of ritual performers. I felt like a piece was missing in my return, but didn't know how to express it. They did sort of welcome me back and spoke of how meaningful and powerful what I had done felt for the overall rite, but there was still something off. When that Vedic ritual was complete and I was on my way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the way I would be doing this part of the ritual was forever changed. My eyes had been opened to a whole new way of recognizing the concept of outdwellers and guardians. I did my own purification when I got home to help offset that strange feeling I had had at the site. But while the at-home cleansing worked, I never really felt completely a part of the group afterwards. It was like I had one foot with the outdwellers permanently. As I moved more deeply into Norse material and began to shape a practice that felt more like my own, the definition of the role shifted. It stopped being about a fixed category of beings and became something more situational. An outdweller in my practice became anything that runs at cross purposes to that moment of sacred being, which can change depending on the reason for the rite. The same presence that stands at the edge one day might be welcomed the next, depending on the work. That flexibility matters even more to me than before. But how to deal with that missing piece I had yet to define? I think first we need to discuss who the outdwellers are to better understand that question. Outdwellers are defined as spirits, beings, energies, entities that operate in opposition to whatever the ritual participant is trying to do. For example, if your rite or working involves recognizing and connecting to beings or spirits of water, you don't really want fire showing up to burn it off. You aren't trying to rid yourself of fire forever, just asking it to maybe focus its eye elsewhere for an hour or so. Then the location returns to its natural state with both the seen and unseen inhabitants. This part is important to recognize. When the separation is first made, an offering or bribe is given to allow you to work in peace without interference. But that treaty is temporary. You must return the land to its original state for balance to be regained. Just opening the circle or declaring the rite is done doesn't cover it. A lot of people forget this part, and I truly believe it has a growing effect as time passes. If the balance is never actively restored, then how long does the treaty have power? At what point do those same Outdwellers say, "That's all well and good, but we're tired of always being on the outside. Your currency is no good to us anymore"? Over time, I learned more about this guardian and outdweller role, leaning heavily into what it means to stand at the boundaries. It's a position that holds power and consequence. The individual who holds it on the part of humans must understand the fullness of the responsibility before taking it on. Yet the role is almost an afterthought in many practices, Druidry included. Within specific hearth cultures, especially when you start digging into Norse cosmology, there's a strong focus on what belongs inside the enclosure of the rite itself. Midgard, the human world, Asgard, the realm of the gods. These are spaces where structure exists, where relationships can form, where expectations and obligations start to make sense. Even the word gard itself carries the idea of an enclosure, a fence or protected space. When I first came into paganism, especially in Reconstructionist circles, I was often taught to think of the world outside those spaces as dangerous by default. Jotunheim became the hostile place, the unknown place, the place you avoided unless you absolutely had to go there. But the older I've gotten in practice, the more I think that understanding is too simple for what the material is actually doing. The concepts of Innangarð and Útangarð helped me finally put language to what I had been feeling for years. Innangarð is the space of community, obligation, reciprocity, and shared understanding. It's the firelight. It's the hall. It's the place where people know your name and where there are agreed upon rules for how everyone behaves. Útangarð is everything beyond that boundary. Not evil or automatically hostile. Just outside the structure you know how to navigate comfortably. Some presences simply do not belong inside a particular working space because their nature, purpose, or movement runs against what is being built there in that moment. That doesn't make them wrong. It just means they remain outside the enclosure for that rite, that prayer, that ritual, which is where the idea of establishing a temporary treaty with the Outdwellers comes in. From the archaeological side of things, bringing these broader ideas of sacred space into my practice grounded things more completely for me. Space in pre-Christian Northern Europe was not treated as neutral. You can see it in settlement layouts, in the placement of farms, in boundary stones, in sacred groves, and in burial mounds. These weren't random choices. People marked space deliberately, both physically and socially. Certain places were for the living, and certain places were for the dead. Specific places were for gathering, trade, ritual, or law. And then there were places you approached differently. carefully, quietly, sometimes not at all. We see heroes and protagonists cross those boundaries in a good chunk of Icelandic sagas. And I believe those boundaries were never only physical. We just lost the stories and myths that helped us understand that. That loss has manifested the need to add sections in our rituals to accommodate those concepts of space and boundary. When I stand in ritual space now, especially in the role of guardian or gatekeeper, I find myself thinking about how deeply human it is to have that instinct. We have always drawn circles around the things we needed to protect, and we have always understood that something existed beyond the edges of the firelight. Take burial mounds, for example. The more time I spent reading both the lore and the archaeological material, the more I realized how intentionally these spaces were placed. Across Scandinavia and the broader Germanic world, burial mounds often sit at the edges of cultivated land, near old roads, along waterways, or just beyond the boundaries of where daily life was happening. They weren't shoved out of sight and declared taboo as we see today, but they also weren't folded comfortably into ordinary living space either. They existed in that in-between place where memory, ancestry, and caution all seemed to meet. People could see them. People knew they were there. But while it was encouraged to recognize, remember, and interact with the spaces, there was an understanding that you approached them differently. Honestly, I think modern people sometimes forget how strong that sense of presence would have been. Today we flatten everything into historical sites or cemeteries. But in these older world views, the dead were not always considered fully gone. Some remained connected to the land, the family, or the mound itself. You see that reflected all through saga material. The Draugr, for example, shows up in texts like Greatest Saga and other Icelandic sagas as a dead being that has not stayed quiet in its resting place. Sometimes they guard treasure, sometimes they defend territory, sometimes they simply refuse to release their hold on the world of the living. And what strikes me every time is that these stories rarely treat the Draugr as random monsters wandering around causing problems for fun. They are usually tied to a place, a boundary, or a violation. Somebody crossed into a space carelessly. Somebody disturbed something that should have been left alone. Somebody ignored the weight of where they were standing. Thus, the idea of Outdweller may have been created. That idea fits so naturally into the older concepts of Innangarð and Útangarð for me. The burial mound sits right on that edge. It is close enough to the human world to still affect it, but far enough outside ordinary life that the rules shift when you approach it. And I think that's part of what pagan practice has slowly taught me over the years. Not every space is meant to feel comfortable just because we can physically walk into it. Some places ask for respect and reverence before interaction. Some ask for distance. And some simply remind us that there are presences in the world that do not belong entirely to us, even when they exist close beside us. You see similar patterns with things like the Herger and the Ve, referenced in Old Norse sources. A Ve isn't just a place. It was a marked space, set apart, often protected by social and legal boundaries. The living could not carry anything of iron within. Some traditions connect Ve spaces with Freyr, the Vanir, and the ancestors, which also meant there were expectations around how people approach those places. Violating that space had consequences, not just socially, but spiritually. And that idea shows up in both the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, where sacred enclosures are treated as distinct from the surrounding world. Then you have legal codes from later periods, like the Icelandic Grágás laws, which still carry echoes of older traditions. Boundaries across land, property, who could enter and when, were taken seriously. there were consequences for crossing them without permission. That same mindset doesn't stay neatly in the legal world. It bleeds into how space itself is understood. Móðguðr stands at Gjárabrú, the bridge that spans the river Gjöll on the road down toward hell. And we meet her in Gylfaginning in the Prose Edda, when Hermod rides out to seek Baldur. It's a quiet moment in the story, but it carries a lot more weight than it looks like at first glance. Hermod has already crossed a huge distance spanning most, if not all, the various listed realms in the mythology. It isn't meant to be easy. It's a journey between life and death, and when he reaches that bridge, he isn't simply allowed to pass. Móðguðr steps forward and asks him who he is, where he is going, and why. She even notes that the dead who have crossed before him made less noise than he does, which is such a small detail, but it tells you exactly where he stands, on a threshold boundary in liminal space and time. He doesn't belong there in the same way as she does, and Móðguðr makes sure he knows it. What I've come to appreciate about her is how contained that interaction is. She doesn't challenge him in a dramatic way, and she doesn't try to stop him outright once he answers. She listens, she weighs what he said, and then she allows him to continue determining that his cause is worthy. There's no conflict or follow-through beyond that point. However, she doesn't become part of his journey, nor does she guide him. She recognizes that he is not a threat to the denizens of the realm, and so returns to her place at the bridge, which is where she remains, ever watchful. I've started to see her less as a figure to engage with and more as an example of what a held boundary actually looks like. She isn't hostile, she isn't welcoming, she's clear. There's a steadiness in that kind of presence. The role is defined and she stays within it completely. That's where she sits, for me, in this conversation about outdwellers and thresholds. She isn't outside in the same way as something like Nidar, and she isn't something to draw into a working space either. She's at the edge, doing exactly what that edge requires. Meeting you briefly, making sure you understand where you are, gauging your purpose in regards to those she guards, and if found worthy, letting you move on without ever stepping into your path. Surtr appears in both Völuspá and Gylfaginning as well, standing at the edge of Muspel. He doesn't actively step into the narrative until Ragnarok, but the threat of him is always present in the background. He marks a boundary more than he participates in the ongoing world. I don't try to make him into something relational unless the situation calls for it. That's not how he presents, and I do my best to respect that. From an academic standpoint, this idea of sacred space being separated from ordinary space shows up again and again, even outside specifically Norse material. Scholars like Mircea Eliade and Hilda Ellis Davidson both spent a great deal of time examining how traditional cultures understood boundaries, ritual spaces, and the difference between what was considered ordered versus uncontrolled. And while I don't always agree with every conclusion Eliade reaches, especially through a modern reconstructionist lens, I do think he touched on something important when he described sacred space as being set apart from ordinary life. Ritual, in his view, required a kind of separation, a threshold that had to be crossed, something that had to be marked off from the rest of the world in order for the experience to carry meaning. Honestly, the more years I spend in pagan practice, the more I think that instinct is deeply human. We still do it now, even outside religion. We lower our voices in hospitals and libraries. We behave differently in courtrooms. We step carefully into funeral homes. Certain spaces carry an understood shift in behavior because the purpose of the space changes what is appropriate within it. That same instinct shows up all through pre-Christian Northern Europe. Hilda Ellis Davidson's work especially points toward how boundaries in Norse belief were not abstract philosophical ideas floating somewhere above daily life. They were woven directly into law, land use, ritual, kinship, hospitality, and cosmology itself. And that's the part that really catches my attention when I think about outdwellers and threshold beings. The Old Norse world was not divided neatly into good and evil the way modern people sometimes want it to be. To make such black and white definitions is to take the easy way out. Instead, it was much more concerned with what belonged where, what maintained order, and what disrupted it. A thing could be powerful without being welcome in every space. A being could be respected without being invited into the hall. Once I started looking at the lore through that lens, a lot of figures that used to seem random or frightening started making a different kind of sense. A sense I began applying to the more modern ideas of outdwellers. When I look at modern pagan practice, I notice there's often a strong pull toward connection. People want to build relationships with the beings they encounter in the lore. They want interaction, signs, communication, some sense of mutual recognition. I understand that instinct because I had it too when I was younger in practice. And even after 24 years, still have that same yearning. There's something intrinsically human about wanting the cosmos to feel relational and reachable. But over time, I've had to become more comfortable with the idea that not every presence exists in a way that is accessible to me, or even interested in being accessible at all. Some of these beings just want to be left alone. In my search to become a bog witch as I age, I completely empathize with just wanting those kids to get off my lawn. Some things simply remain at the edges of the enclosure. They alter the feeling of a space without fully entering it. Some presences feel incompatible with the purpose of a rite or gathering, not because they are evil or malicious, but because their nature moves in a different direction than the work being done. I think that's where the modern conversation around outdwellers sometimes loses nuance. The word itself can make people imagine enemies standing outside the circle, rattling the gates. But that isn't really how I understand it now. An outdweller in my practice is anything that runs at cross purposes to that moment, which can change depending on the circumstances and location. That same presence that stands at the edge one day might be welcomed the next, depending on the work. What matters is recognizing that distinction without immediately turning it into hostility. Other does not automatically mean dangerous. It does not always mean unwelcome either. Sometimes it simply means outside the structure you are building at that time. And once you begin thinking about sacred space that way, you start noticing something else in the lore too. Boundaries rarely exist without someone or something holding them in place. Once I started paying attention to boundaries in the lore, I also started noticing how often there is someone standing near them. Not always guarding in the sense of holding a weapon at a gate, but maintaining the shape of a thing, watching the crossing point, holding the line between one state and another. I think that's an important distinction because modern pagan spaces sometimes talk about guardians as if they're simply spiritual security guards, standing around waiting to throw something out. The older material feels more layered than that to me. The beings connected to thresholds in Norse cosmology are often there to witness, regulate, announce, or stabilize movement between worlds rather than simply block access outright. Heimdallr is probably the clearest example. In the lore, especially in Gylfaginning within the Prose Edda, he stands watch over Bifrost, the bridge between worlds. He is described as needing less sleep than a bird, able to hear grass growing and wool forming on sheep, which honestly sounds exhausting, but also tells you exactly what kind of figure he is. Heimdallr is awareness. He is attention held at the threshold itself. His role is not simply to fight when Ragnarok arrives. His role is to notice when something approaches long before everyone else does. And that kind of awareness feels deeply familiar to me as someone who has stood ritual boundary before. You are not standing there expecting attack every moment. You are listening to the shape of the space. You are paying attention to shifts in atmosphere, movement, tension, interruption, distraction, all the subtle things that tell you whether the enclosure is still holding together the way it should. The Norns function similarly, though in a quieter way. Urd, Verdandi, and Skúð sit at the roots of Yggdrasil in both the poetic and prose Edda, tending the well and shaping fate itself. They are not gatekeepers in the dramatic sense, but they absolutely hold boundaries. They maintain continuity. They keep the strands from unraveling completely. Fate in Norse thought is not loose and abstract. It is structured, layered, woven carefully through obligation, consequence, ancestry, and action. The Norns sit at the edge between what has happened, what is unfolding, and what has not yet arrived. And I think a lot of modern practitioners miss how boundary-oriented that really is. Holding ritual space often feels less like standing with a sword and more like tending threads so the work stays coherent. Even Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse, moves through the lore as a boundary crosser. He travels between worlds in ways other beings cannot. We see that most clearly when Hermod rides him toward Hel after Baldr's death. Sleipnir is capable of moving safely through spaces that are dangerous, liminal, or inaccessible to others. And in practice, I think there's something important there too. The person standing boundary in ritual often becomes a kind of bridge figure themselves. Not fully inside the working, not fully outside it either. They stand in the threshold space, so movement can happen safely and intentionally, which is why they do not actively participate in the ritual. At least, they shouldn't. That role became very real to me during my years working within ADF ritual structure. When you physically stand at the edges of sacred space, acknowledging outdwellers while also maintaining the enclosure for the folk gathered within it, you begin to understand that boundary work is about clarity. It is about recognizing what belongs to the purpose of that rite and what does not, and then holding that line for those that are present. Sometimes that means redirecting energy or grounding the group from the outside. Other times it simply means noticing when something feels off before everyone else does. The old stories suddenly stop feeling abstract when you've stood in that role yourself. It's a heady feeling to step into those shoes and hold the line with the big dogs. I think that is one of the reasons these figures continue to matter in modern pagan practice. Heimdallr watching the bridge, Móðguðr questioning travelers at Gjallarbrú, the Norns tending the roots beneath the worlds. None of them are maintaining boundaries through domination alone. They do it through awareness, presence, and steadiness. The line holds because someone is willing to remain attentive. There's a natural overlap here with gatekeepers and guardians. Some beings stand at thresholds and regulate passage. Others exist beyond those thresholds entirely. And that feels less like fantasy to me these days, and more like one of the oldest human responsibilities there is. A responsibility we need to reclaim in its full meaning when in sacred space. As the representative in the human realm, you share the role with whatever gatekeeper and or guardian called upon. Which brings us back to that missing piece question I asked earlier. How do we come back from all of that to the mundane? The answer is simple. The community we stepped outside the boundary for has to help bring us back. If someone stands at the edge of the enclosure on behalf of the folk, if they take on the role of negotiator, protector, witness, or boundary holder, there should be an understanding that they do not simply snap their fingers and return untouched the moment ritual ends. Older cultures understood this far better than we tend to now. Crossing the thresholds and contact with the dead mattered. Standing between the worlds mattered. I like to think that there would have been rituals of return, purification, washing, blessing, reintegration, shared meals, or communal acknowledgement afterward. Not because the person was tainted in some dramatic fantasy sense, but because human beings are not really built to stand in liminal spaces indefinitely. Eventually, you need someone to call you home again. I think this is one of the quiet failures in a lot of modern pagan practice. We've become very focused on opening doors, calling powers, reaching outward and diving deep, pushing boundaries. But we spend far less time talking about how to close things gently and fully, nor how to bring people back into ordinary human space afterward. The person standing guard or holding the boundary often gets treated like they were simply performing a function, but energetically, emotionally, spiritually, sometimes physically, they were carrying part of the weight of the right for everyone else present the entire time. I've seen this happen so many times over the years. The ritual finishes with the usual bookends. People hang out to chat for a few minutes or eat a plate at the potluck. Maybe they help out by stacking chairs or cleaning up offerings before grabbing their bags. Then everyone disappears back into their lives, while the people who were holding the structure are still standing there, half outside themselves, trying to settle back into ordinary reality. They are left forgotten, their act of guardianship a blip from the past. And if you've never stood that role before, it can sound overly dramatic when described out loud. But if you have stood it, you know exactly what I mean. There is a strange feeling sometimes after deep ritual work where part of your awareness is still listening for something that is no longer there. That's why older ritual systems may have placed so much emphasis on closing actions. Shared food, drinking together, blessings, washing hands, re-entering ordinary conversation. Laughter, honestly, is part of it too, bringing the body and mind back toward familiarity, re-establishing Innangarð for everyone again, the hall, the hearth, and the human world. You leave the threshold space deliberately, just like you entered it deliberately. We rush through closing things down with quick words and gestures. The power and energy raised to begin with is left to fizzle out with barely a whimper. How can balance be restored in that scenario when the energy to close is not equal to the energy to open? There is no closing for the person or people that have held that guardian role. They are left on their own way too often while the folk do their own thing. We have forgotten that they need to be welcomed back from the edge, their sacrifice acknowledged and celebrated by those they protected. It's part of the ritual process, an enormously important part. I think there's a lesson in that far outside ritual practice, We are living in a time when people are constantly being pulled into liminal emotional spaces, endless outrage cycles, fear, conflict, grief, hypervigilance, people standing guard for their families, their communities, their identities, their safety. What I keep noticing is that very few people are being brought back afterward. Very few are welcomed home emotionally once the moment has passed. We expect these people to hold impossible lines and then return to normal without care, acknowledgement, or restoration. But humans have never worked that way. Not in the sagas, not in ritual, not now. They are left abandoned to that space outside of community. How long can a person exist in that liminal space without losing themselves? At some point, the community must step forward and say, you can come back inside now. Without this, we are doomed to wander, our connection slowly unraveling until we are ultimately alone. Thank you for sitting with me today as we discussed ideas of outdwellers and working with them. Next time, we'll dive into the land spirits, who they are, what they want, and how we fit into that same mold. My lovely little heathens and heathen friendlies, have a beautiful week as we begin the trek into late spring and early summer. Remember your connection to the divine, and in the middle of everything swirling through the world right now, don't forget to stop and find your sacred breath.